board of directors. Well, any of you know of the Veterans Breakfast Club or members of the Veterans Breakfast Club by chance? No. Yeah, it's been around. It's a nonprofit based in Pittsburgh, started by a man named Todd Bastina, who's a real PhD historian from Princeton or Yale. And he started it 15, 17 years ago. He was doing research on World War II, and he started interviewing a lot of World War II veterans, and they started having breakfast together. That's where the name came from. And before long, he was having breakfast with 40, 50 people and then more. And then their families started to come. And what he saw was that when the veterans were together and with their families, they started to talk more. And he came up with this sort of theme that veteran storytellings connect, heal, educate, and inspire. So he's gone on for a long time since then. We have a small staff, mostly volunteers like me. And we have 1,600 members that are paid members. It's a whopping $36 a year, so it's not exactly tough economically to join. We have live breakfast events. We have evening events. We have all sorts of events during the year. When the pandemic started, all of a sudden you couldn't have breakfast, especially with a bunch of 75 and 80-year-old people. So we turned to the internet, and it changed our whole system. It changed our whole programming because all of a sudden now you could do things that were nationwide. You didn't have to just have breakfast with people in southwestern Pennsylvania. So that's when I got involved as a board member, and then Todd asked me to become the host of something we call Greatest Generation Live, original title, right? It's basically all things about World War II. So for the last 4 years now, I've interviewed probably 30 or 40 World War II veterans, a lot of authors from a lot of places, a lot of big name authors like Don Miller, who we will hear about in a minute. A lot of people who just wrote a book about their father, that kind of thing. And it's on every Thursday night at 7 o'clock. And for the last 3 months, we've been focusing on Masters of the Air, or the Air War over Europe. I took a little broader view of it than just Masters of the Air, which is just about the 100th Bomber Group in the 8th Air Force, which were the heavy bombers, okay? Have any of you been watching Masters of the Air? Okay, a couple. Anybody else? No, okay. So have you watched all the episodes now? So,
Yes.
yeah. Do we have, how many veterans other than this young man here? What is your name, sir?
Dick Holm, H-O-L-M.
Dick Holm, okay. Any other veterans in the room? Yes, sir. I see you have a P-51 hat on. Did you fly one?
I can't even fly a kite.
Oh. I'm certified in kite flying.
No,
Okay, you just like P-51s?
no, I wish I had a. I ran a Corsair over a block,
I'm sorry,
a chalk.
okay,
It was on chalks, and I ran the engine up and it jumped the chalk.
okay. So what did you do you were in the Air Force?
I was in the Marine Corps.
Marine Corps, ah, okay, Vietnam?
No, I didn't have to go, I was doing the Korean War.
Korean War, oh, fascinating. Yeah, there's a lot of Korean War veterans that are members. Well, we've done a lot of programming. This was the Forgotten War. Not too many Americans. Did I see your hand go up, sir?
Yes, it's in the Air Force,
Air Force, what years?
66 to 70.
Vietnam?
No,
No, okay.
I was I guarded Hoosiers in Indiana.
Yeah,
We flew every day, never got off the
Yeah.
ground.
Yeah.
I worked on flight simulators.
okay. Service is service, whether you got abroad or not, you know. 16 million people served in World War II, about a third of them never left the United States.
You can say where you have your meetings at,
I can't.
where you have your meetings.
All over, up this way. Probably the closest place we have the meetings is, I'm gonna get the name wrong, it's at church there just off of Mount Nebo Road, Bethel Church, I think it is. But we have them in fact, if you all just take one of these magazines, all our meetings are listed in the magazines. If you go on our website, all the meetings are listed on the website. If you sign up for our emails, I'll let you pass it around. Feel free to not sign up if you're not comfortable with it. You'll get the emails about all our meetings. So, and you'll get the emails about our links to the programming that we do online. So that's a little bit about me. I'm actually not a veteran, although I came from a military family. My father was an enlisted man in the military, so I grew up in the Army, a classic Army brat. I lived in many different bases. My mom, I was telling this young man, was a nurse's aide at Pearl Harbor Hospital on December 7th, 1941. And she was there. My mom, born and raised in Hawaii. She's about a third Hawaiian. And believe it or not, I'm about 10% Hawaiian. I don't know what 10% possibly could be, but I am. And we just celebrated her 104th birthday. She lives in Scott Township. She lives on her own. We do have a caretaker that comes and helps her 4 or 5 days a week for a few hours. That's it. She's remarkable, remarkable, remarkable. And she's part of the reason I became a World War II historian, because people would ask her to tell her story. She wasn't really good at telling stories, so I would help her tell her story. And obviously it was about the Pearl Harbor attack, and I would put it into context of what happened in the Pacific War at that time. So World War II history is my hobby. I don't have a degree in it. My degree is in English, economics, and then international finance. So it's just a hobby gone wild. Okay. So what have I got here first? Okay. Why isn't that working, Katie? Did I mess it up already? It was working.
There's something a few minutes ago that said it was recording.
Well, she has me on Zoom as well for people that might want to be on Zoom.
It's because we're cursed tonight.
We're first, okay, well, that's official.
Yeah, yeah.
If worst case, I can just. It was working when we first hooked it up.
You were all witness, right?
Well, I pushed every button twice.
Yeah, we may just have to.
There we go. Oh, did you do that?
I did that.
You did that.
Wait, maybe you did it too.
No, there we go. We're going. Okay. So we're going to England. There's a flyer over here. If you would like to take one, please do. We have 27 people signed up all ready to go. We're going to go see the very bomber bases that we're going to be talking about. The World War II sites. This is at Duxford, England. It's the Battle of Britain Air Show. And for those of you that have watched Master of the Air on TV, that's Thorpe Abbott's original tower that was shown on television. We're going to go there, another bomber base as well.
Well, I read an interesting fact the other day that the Glenn Miller's family donated his trumpet to the Air Force Museum.
Oh, yeah? Okay, well. Okay, so what are we going to talk about tonight? We're going to talk about the air war over Europe in general, okay? And I kind of made this into 10 things you should know about the U.S. Army Air Forces in World War II, right? To try to make it work. I said this now, it's not working.
Okay, try it. Jinxed it, as usual. Try it again.
Okay. Pray a lot. So Masters of the Air is based on this book, Donald Miller's book. If any of you read this book? Yeah, so I'm taking the while. It's a big book, right? And actually, you know, Don's book, and I've interviewed Don. I sent Katie, I sent you the links to all the interviews I've done. I've interviewed Don back in December. That's what started me on this. Fascinating guy. He wrote this 10 or 12 years ago. And actually, it's about the whole 8th Air Force, not just the 100th Bomb Group. 100th Bomb Group featured in the series. There's only about 2 or 3 chapters dedicated to that, right? So the series is actually a much more deeper dive into the 100th Bomb Group. But I highly recommend this book. So where were we in 1942? The Germans have overrun Europe, and the Japanese have overrun the Pacific by and large. Okay, and I started in early 1942 because that's when the 8th Air Force was formed. But up until 1941, we're in terrible shape here in terms of preparedness. The U.S. Army Air Corps, that it was called back then, right, was a tiny little outfit, maybe a couple hundred planes, most of them, you know, old biplanes, you know, very, very few modern planes. I think the number was like 20-odd thousand men in the U.S. Army Air Corps at that time. This is a picture of the U.S. Army And I kind of made a little joke out of this, but they were also very unprepared, right? This is during the 1940 Louisiana maneuvers. Luckily, by then, the National Guard had been called up and the Army was, and the draft had started, at least was announced. And we were building towards a 1 million man army. This is December 7th, 1941. My mom saw all this. And that's when the Japanese sunk the most part of our Pacific fleet, right? Luckily, the carriers were not there. I think most of you know that story. The US carriers were not in harbor by luck, literally by luck. They were not in carrier. Not January 1942, the US Army's, or the US, at this point now, the US Army Air Force, renamed US Army Air Force, was founded, or the 8th was founded, and this thing is now jumping on its own, Katie. Founded in Savannah, Georgia, which is why the 8th Air Force Museum is in Savannah, Georgia. Founded by 7 men and no planes. Okay, a lot of hope, right? So item number 1, when the 8th Air Force gets to England in 1942, in March of 1942, again, 7 men and no planes, right? What did they have? They had superb leadership. Anybody recognize this man?
Mr. 20,
Say again?
820. No, that's Hap Arnold.
Hap Arnold, right? General Hap Arnold.
Wrong with that.
Yeah, who was the head of the US Army Air Force at that time. Fascinating man. He held pilot license number, I forget for sure, 5 or 6 from the Wright brothers, trained by the Wright brothers in 1911, when he had been just out of West Point for a couple of years. He eventually became the head of the US Army Air Forces under General Marshall, or with General Marshall, who was the head of the US Army, Chief of Staff of the US Army. They called him Hap Arnold because he always had this grin on his face. And he was a pleasant sort of guy outwardly. Actually, he was a driving, hardcore, difficult to get along with guy. But he did his job. He suffered 4 heart attacks in World War II, all because of overwork. I'm sorry.
You're fine.
Okay, all because of overwork. He can be thought of as the father of the US Army Air Force, or the US Air Force. And he strived, in this part of the story, part of the negative part of the story, he strived for that independence, for the Air Force to become independent from the US Army. These are some of the other leaders. In the middle is Tui Spatz, who was the leader of all the Army Air Forces in Europe. On the left is Ira Aker, who at the beginning was the head of the 8th Air Force in England in early 1942. On the right is Bomber Harris, as they called him. He was the head of the RAF Bomber Command. A little bit more about him later, okay? And now we get down to the 100th Bomb Group. Do you remember this man in the Apple TV series? He's portrayed by a really pretty interesting character. He's a graduate of West Point, I think 1935 or so. Really, he was there for the toughest part of the 100th Bomb Group's command from the time they got there, mid-1943 through early 1944. And the only reason he left was really out of exhaustion, but he also had a gallbladder problem, right? But he was a hardcore driving man. And this is our star, Lucky Luckadoo, still alive, 102. This is the book about him. It's on the reading list that I gave you, Damn Lucky, written by Kevin Maurer. I've interviewed both of them 2 or 3 times. And a little bit later, I'm going to play an interview of Lucky. Lucky's a fascinating guy at 102. He's the last living member as a pilot of the 100th Bomb Group. Still gets around the country like he's 45 years old. He's out of Tennessee, joined the US Army Air Force out of college, went through pilot training. He actually was a pilot for B-26s, or B-25s, which were 2-engine bombers. And at the last minute in mid-1943, they took his whole class of pilots for that and moved them in to be co-pilots of B-17s. Why? Because the casualties were so high with the 100th Bomb Group. And it was called the Bloody 100th for a very good reason, as you'll see. Daylight precision bombing. Anybody here really know what that is? What they were talking about? Okay. The bomber mafia. It really was a flawed strategy. Lucky's going to talk about that a little bit later. Daylight precision bombing based on this instrument, Norden bomb sight. This one's at Soldiers and Sailors Hall. You can go down and see it. It's it's there, right? Norden bomb sight really was created in the late 1920s and 1930s by a Dutch engineer who came to the United States. And it was meant to be sort of the first analog computer, if you will. And they said you could drop a bomb from 10,000 or 20,000 feet into a pickle barrel. But you'll see the problems that came about with that. 1935, the first 4-engine heavy bomber is created by Boeing under work by the U.S. Army Air Force. So it was the first bomber. It was by far the most opportune development that the U.S. Army Air Force developed in the 1930s. At this point, this was faster than any fighter plane. It could fly higher than any fighter plane. It had more armament than any other plane. It had, at this point in this early model, 10 or 11 50 caliber machine guns. And this was the point. This and the Norden bomb sight is what enabled the U.S. Army Air Force to develop daylight precision bombing, strategic bombing, okay? Strategic bombing, what do we mean by strategic bombing? So as opposed to tactical bombing. Tactical bombing is when the smaller planes normally, probably a lot of what this young man did in Korea, right, are supporting the ground troops. They're taking out tanks, they're taking out artillery, they're taking out bridges. They're going in front of the men on the ground. Strategic bombing, it was when you go over the front lines and you take out the industrial infrastructure of your enemy, okay? And that was something brand new in the 1930s that was developed by the U.S. Army Air Force at Maxwell Air Force Base in 1937, 1938, some by those very men I had up earlier, okay? They came up with this concept because anybody recognize this from World War I? How many men did the Brits lose in World War I? Almost 1 million, if you count the colonial troops. How many men did the French lose in World War I? 1,000,004. How many did the Germans lose in World War I? Over 2 million. How many did the Russians lose? Lost count. Lost count. 4 or 5 million. How many did we lose in World War I? 128,000. About half of them in combat, the other half due to non-combat reasons, mostly for the Spanish flu. So what was the thinking at that time in the 1930s? They saw another war coming, Hitler's in charge. You could see that the Germans are rearming, the Japanese are having their rearmament. The thinking was, if you could go over the trenches, because they thought, again, we'd be fighting in trenches, just as we did in World War I.
Your attention, please. Would Jeffrey Moore please come to the customer service desk on the lower level? Jeffrey Moore. Thank you.
The thinking was, let's avoid all those casualties and let's develop these heavy bombers using precise instruments like the Norden bomb sight to fly over the trenches and take out the steel factories, the ball bearing factories, the electric generation, et cetera, right? Pretty good idea, sacrifice millions of men or sacrifice a few thousand, in airplanes, right? Pretty good idea in 1937, 1939. So this becomes strategic daylight bombing becomes the doctrine. Now, they were called the bomber mafia. Who was called the bomber mafia? The U.S. Army Air Force generals who developed that doctrine. Who called them the bomber mafia? Pretty negative term, pretty pejorative. It's used in the show a little bit if you catch it. The U.S. Army Ground Forces called them the bomber mafia. Why? Because the U.S. Army Ground Forces wanted them to do tactical bombing, not strategic bombing. So, they developed this theory, this doctrine, and the ground force people didn't like it. So they started calling them the mafia, the bomber mafia. Right? There's a great book called The Bomber Mafia. Look it up. So what happens? They get to Europe finally in 1942, and they find that their theory has been outstripped by the technology. First of all, there's all this flak going up. You saw it again in the Masters of the Air show. Flak was artillery fired straight up in the air by the Germans, right? Fired up with an 88 cannon, which is it was a basic big German cannon at the time, adapted, here it is, right? And it was preset to explode at 25,000 feet, 30,000 feet, whatever, right? And basically it was a shell that exploded into 1,000 pieces of shrapnel. And if it hit the right part of the plane or hit the inside of the plane, it would take out the plane. And they took them out by the hundreds and the thousands. The other thing that happened, developed radar. Battle of Britain, 1940. What did the Brits have that saved them? Radar, right? First use of radar, 1940 by the Brits. Radar had been developed in the late 30s, but hadn't been operational. The Brits made it operational. The Germans saw that and they copied it. This is a German radar station on the coast of France in 1942. And they linked it up with the guns. So the guns were, not all of them, but many of them were radar controlled. Okay, we didn't know any of that in 1939, nor did we have the intelligence. B-17 being attacked, frontal attack right at the nose by a German fighter. I'm not sure which one that is. It's a 109 or a 190. I think it's a 190. Anyway, German fighter. By this time, the fighters now can go faster than the bombers. The bombers had an airspeed of 230, 240 miles per hour. The fighters are going 350 or more miles per hour. And the Germans developed these techniques to take them down. So when we get there in 1942, all that theory about daylight strategic bombing kind of goes down the tubes. I'm certain many of you have worked in corporations, government, whatever. It's called bureaucracy, right? The bureaucracy had an idea, they put it into place, and then when the reality hit when that theory hit reality, it didn't work. Now I got caught up. I was a banker for many years in big banks, and I got caught up in that. Where, same sort of thing, but nobody died. Here thousands of people end up dying. The other thing they didn't account for was the weather, right? Despite that Norden bomb sight, it couldn't see through the clouds, right? At this point in the war, this is actually 1944. They had the beginning of radar, right? That could see down below the clouds, but not very well. But they run into the weather, and the weather is just terrible in northwestern Europe. So that idea of using the Norden bomb sight to drop the bomb with precision and drop it into a pickle barrel, as you hear a little bit later from John Luckadoo. Terrible. They fought in extreme conditions, right? They fought at 25, 30, 35,000 feet. How cold is it at 30,000 feet?
Very cold.
40 degrees, 30 degrees, negative Fahrenheit. Unpressurized, open windows throughout the plane, except in the front for the pilot and the bombardiers, you'll see in a minute, right? They wore everything they could possibly think of, including underneath this is what they call the bunny suit, right? Which was like an electric blanket shaped into a long johns kind of thing. And it really didn't work all that well. Lots of times it gets shorted out, right? So very difficult conditions. Here's a waist gunner in a B-17. You can see he's up to his ankle in 50 caliber shells. He's got everything you can think of on, including a lead jacket, right? And you see the air mask he's got on. Let me give you a couple of quotes. This is from a man named Keith Newhouse. The mask felt like a clammy hand grasping your face. The condensation inside that instrument of torture drips down your neck to chill you and freeze you on your face and collar. And they're up there for 6, 7, 8 hours in those kind of conditions, right? Back to the flak. This is about flak. You could take no evasive action against a box barrage. There was only one way to counteract it, and it began with, "Our Father, who art in heaven." Right? These guys were dying by the thousands at this time in 42 and 43. The cold. I could feel sweat on my forehead and marvel that a man could freeze and sweat simultaneously. Right? During combat, all that adrenaline running through your body, you sweat. Right? This is the inside of the cockpit of a B-17. That's the view from the bombardier with the plexiglass nose, right? That was supposedly bulletproof, but really wasn't. Right, the bombardier sitting there, there's the Norden bomb site, the navigators behind them, the pilot and co-pilot are above them, right? This is where 2/3 of the injuries took place. Because the Germans would attack from the front, and they knew if they took out the pilot and co-pilot or the bombardier, then the plane was useless. All right, so 2/3 of the casualties took place here. Ball turned. Anybody familiar with this? I'll show you another. Yes, ma'am.
My father.
Oh, I thought you were in a ball turn. Sort of little enough that you could fit in.
He was little, he fit in there. He fit in there.
Father, yeah. Who did he fly with?
That group, big bomb group.
Do you know what bomb group he flew with, or any specific? The 100th bomber group?
100 or 101 or something, 101.
100 something. 100. Well, there were 42 different bomb groups, so, yeah. So if you go on my website or you look up our website, or you search us on YouTube, 2 weeks ago I did an interview of Les Schrenk, who was a ball turret gunner, 100 years old, shot down, and was a prisoner of war as well. 5'11", he was the tallest ball turret gunner there was. We asked him, how'd you become a ball turret gunner? He goes, I was the last guy to join the crew. He said, how in the world did you fit in this thing? The only way he fit in it, he had to take all his other clothes off. Just, couldn't wear that heavy jacket, couldn't wear, so, terrible what they make a living, all right? But these guys, your father, I'd love to know more about your father.
He has the Distinguished Flying Cross.
He should have more than that.
Did they just get in the ball turret when they were on the mission, or did they take off and land in there?
No, most of the time the plane would take off after it was in the air for a bit. Once it started across the English Channel, then they would crawl in. But they'd be in there for 5-6 hours, depending on the length of the mission. Then they get out. The problem was sometimes they couldn't get out. Right, especially when the plane was shot up, maybe going down. Oftentimes they couldn't get out. There's a few terrible stories about ball turret gunners who couldn't get out, and the plane had a belly wing. Didn't survive, obviously. This was really high tech at the time, right? That's the B-17 again. This is now a war version, 1942, 1943. They kept improving it. Different models came out. We produced 12,000 some of these. Right, remember, I didn't tell you that. 1937 or 35 was the first flight. 37, the U.S. Army Air Corps made their first big order of B-17s. They ordered 17 because they thought that was a lot. 1937. We ended up making 13,000 of these, of which almost half were shot down. B-24, that's the other big heavy bomber produced by the United States. That didn't come along until 1940, 41, produced by a different manufacturer, consolidated. As you can see, it's a very different looking plane. We produced 17,000 of these, about a third were shot down, right? And actually carried a little heavier load, could actually go a little faster. And forever and a day, there's a great argument between B-17 and B-24 guys as to which was better, which was not. Lucky Luckadoo, who you'll see in a minute, he called the B-24 the box that the B-17 came in. The argument is the B-17, which was a much sturdier plane, could take a lot more punishment, right, than the B-24. And I think they were right, actually. But nevertheless, 17,000 of these things. High tech, the Norden bomb site was considered extremely high tech. This is the P-47 fighter plane, which came along in 1941, 1942. I have a man that interviewed a man that flew one of these. It was called the Thunderbolt. It was a big, heavy plane. They called it the Flying Jug because of its shape. Very sturdy, very hard to shoot down. Ended up being used a lot for tactical missions. But at first, it was used to escort the bombers in 1942 and 1943. P-38s was that twin engine plane was also used, but it didn't have the range. And it couldn't stand up against the better German fighters. Didn't have the ability to what do you call it, go up? Not just going down, to what?
Zoom.
Zoom up, yeah. Didn't have the ability to climb real fast, and then above like 25,000 feet, its performance just wasn't as good. So eventually, and this is the story, along comes this beautiful bird, the P-51, which unfortunately does not come into service until late 43 and not into big numbers until 44. This plane was better than, and we're going to tell the story of it a little bit later. This plane was better than any German plane by far. And it could escort, especially with these tanks underneath were gas tanks that they would drop after they were done with them. They could escort heavy bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Okay. And in fact, once Hermann Göring saw these over Berlin, he reportedly said, "That's it, we're done. We're not going to win this war." So 42 and 43 were the years of extreme sacrifice. But despite the horrible casualties that occurred, we made our way through it. 77% of the men who flew in 1942 and 1943 in heavy bombers were casualties. Right? So you're standing there with four guys. The old story was look to your left to your right with three guys. This one now you got four guys. Look around, only one of you is going to make it through 1942 and 1943. Right? They were either shot down, killed, POW, injured, whatever. That's the attrition rate. 42 bomber bases and I think 13 or 14 fighter bases in East Anglia. This is the part of Great Britain that is closest to France, right? Built over the course of the war. So, and then interspersed among this, only a little bit further to the west, where the RAF bases as well. So it's almost like a floating, a aircraft carrier though on land, right? This is the building at Thorpe's Abbot that we're going to visit. This was the flight station, if you will, the bomber station for the 100th bomb group. 100th bomb group comes to England in May of 1942, 36 bombers in a bomb group at that time. And this is where they were stationed at the famous Thorpe's Abbot. It's a museum now. Colonel Paul Tibbets, anybody recognize that name?
Yeah, Nola Gay.
Yeah. Colonel Paul Tibbets was the hotshot B-17 pilot in 1942. The best pilot that we had, right? August 17th, 1942, he takes 12 B-17s on the first mission over Europe, flies to the submarine pens in France, drops bombs on the submarine pens to no real effect, kind of did okay. It was considered a huge success. No planes were shot down. They had very little German interference. All the bombs were on target. It said, daylight precision bombing works. This is good, right? Brits, by the way, were bombing at night, right? The British Bomber Command decided to bomb at night. Why? Because they spent 1940 and 1941 getting shot to pieces during the day. And they thought we were foolish. But we said, no, we have this daylight precision bombing technique we're going to use, and we've got flying fortresses. And the idea with flying fortresses is they can fly to the target and back and not need fighter escort. Why? Because they've got, at that time now, 12, 13 50 caliber machine guns that can protect themselves. That was the theory, right? So the other thing about Paul Tibbets, August 17th, 1942, 12 bombers on the first mission to Europe. August 6th, 1945, 3 years, less than 3 years, less than 3 years, he drops the bomb on Hiroshima. Right? It's an incredible time frame when you think about it in the development of these weapons. Curtis LeMay, anybody familiar with him?
Yes, I worked for him.
You worked for him, realist. One of my favorite characters, the best bomber commander in World War II. Both in the Atlantic and then eventually in the Pacific, he leads the B-29s. Okay, comes to the commander of the 305th Bomb Group. He's out of Ohio State, by the way, if you're Ohio State fan. Leads the 305th, and he comes to England in October of 1943. You got that right? No, October 1942. Okay, And he gets there and he sees what's going on and he's really like, I don't get it. We're not dropping enough bombs on target. And we're getting shot down really kind of fast, even though they're still just in 1942, they're only bombing France. They don't penetrate Germany until 1943. So he comes up with several concepts. The first is the IP, the initial point. So up until this time, as the bombers were streaming in to bomb a target and the flak started coming up and the fighters started coming in, the bombers would take evasive action to avoid the flak, to try to avoid the flak. So they got over the target and they were scattered. And the bombing results were terrible because of that. So he calculates that, look, if you, from the initial point, which is usually a point about 5 or 6 miles, it's a navigational concept, 5 or 6 miles from the target, just fly straight. You cannot vary your flight. And at that point, the bombardier takes over using the Norton bomb sight, which had an automatic pilot device attached to it. So the plane would fly straight and narrow, even though it was flying through that flak barrage you saw earlier. And he said, we actually will suffer fewer casualties and we'll have a much higher accuracy rate on the bomb sight, which was absolutely true. They suffered fewer casualties, right? Because he came up with this calculation that it would take 356 shells to shoot down one B-17. And your chances were this. And as Lucky Luckadoo will say, when you were doing zigging and zagging, he says, you know, sometimes you zigged when you should have zagged, and sometimes you zagged when you should have zigged, and it really kind of didn't make any difference. He also comes up with this box formation. You know, in the series, they talk about having tight formations, right? And that was part of the theory of being able to protect themselves. You see these blue zones, that was the radius of what the 50 caliber machine guns could shoot, right? They were limited as to where they could shoot because they didn't want to shoot down the other planes and didn't want to shoot off their own tail, that kind of thing. But you can see that if you have 200 or 300 planes flying in this kind of a box formation, and you have all that firepower, yeah, the German fighters actually were quite afraid of this, right? They quite, you know, but they developed their techniques. And one of the techniques was the fly straight in. The other technique was to stay out of range and fire rockets and bazookas out. Okay. So that's the state of things in late 1942. November of 42, we invade North Africa and we start the whole Mediterranean campaign. Why does that make a difference? Because it took huge amount of resources from the 8th Air Force in England, and instead they're sent to North Africa. And there's safety in numbers. You got 20 bombers, that's not so good. You got 60 bombers, that's better. You got 160 bombers, that's better, because now you have this zone of protection around. But they didn't have as many bombers as they thought they'd have because of this. Recognize these two guys? FDR and Winston Churchill. Casablanca, January 1943. Winston Churchill and the British in general want the US to stop daylight precision bombing because we're getting slaughtered, even though we haven't penetrated Germany yet. And they want them to join the British Bomber Command and bomb at night. And they almost do it. They almost force us to do this, but Ira Aker comes in and convinces him to do what? He convinces him to do round-the-clock bombing. And Churchill, being Churchill, likes this phrase because it's a phrase. He goes, we'll do round-the-clock bombing. His famous phrase, and there's a book by this name, just interviewed the author last year, the buggers will get no sleep. And so they go ahead with daylight bombing. January or August, let me get this date right. January 1943, January, well, here I got the date. Can't do everything by memory. January 27th, 1943, the first mission to Germany, Wilhelmshaven, the port on the Baltic coast. Right, first successful penetration of any penetration of Germany. Right, so what Churchill and them called this was the combined bomber offensives. Bomber command, RAF at night, and us during the day. Right. And now we begin to try to take out that German infrastructure, right? Their naval facilities, their oil facilities, their electric facilities, etc. Right? Problem was, we're getting shot to hell. Really bad. May 21st, mission to Bremen, 98 bombers. We lose 15 in the air. Another few come back like this with injured on board. 15 planes lost, 150 men down. Mission to Bremen, June 13th, 151 bombers, 26 bombers lost, 260 men down. Hanover, July 26th, 232 bombers, 24 lost. Oops, I'm flipping. Terrible, terrible scenes. These men go up day after day after day and face these conditions. Right. This is the mission to Schweinfurt in October 14th. 376 bombers, 60 lost, 600 men, plus all the men that came back in planes like that, injured or dead on the planes, right? At this point, we're losing the air war. The Germans are winning the air war, right? Let me play this. This is Lucky Luckadoo. That's not Lucky, that's Todd DiPastino being funny with a fake. One episode, now it's one episode at a time.
Got it, got it. Tony, we have Tony has his hand up and Brad has his hand up. Tony, you go first.
All right, awesome. Hey, it's great to meet Kevin and Lucky virtually. And I have a question for Lucky, maybe Kevin as well. In the miniseries, Egan and Cleveland are portrayed as kind of these crazy guys, right? Kind of these wild antics. I'd like to get your impression on that, Lucky. There seem to be a lot of serious people in the 100th as well. Did you think those antics helped create a kind of glue and a personality for that unit? Or do you think it was just a giant distraction?
Well, actually, it proved to be something of a safety valve. As you can imagine, we were terribly focused on what we were there to do, and we were sticking our noses to the grindstone and going out as frequently as we possibly could, as the weather allowed us, and sticking our necks out. And one of the things that I would point out to you that does not happen in wartime is that when you lose a crew, when a crew goes down, there's no memorial, there's no funeral, there's no recognition of the fact that they're gone. You just have empty bunks, which you have to refill immediately with replacements. So it's a terribly maturing and bitter experience. We don't have time to grieve. We don't have time to even ponder what the loss of that particular crew is going to mean to the success of the whole outfit. And so you just go out and do your job and keep doing it and keep your nose to the grindstone. Many of the things that Glenn has talked about as far as the strategy of the bombing and the utilization of the bomber forces was all done behind the scenes. We were not privy as crewmen to any of that. We weren't aware that the British were strongly objecting to our going out in the daytime and advised against it. We were just guinea pigs. We were trying to prove a strategy that had been devised by the mafia, and they were convinced that it would work and wanted to prove that it could, but it was flawed. It was badly flawed. The concept of fighter escort was flawed. The concept of the Norden bomb site was flawed. It was a myth. Theoretically, it could drop a bomb within a pickle barrel from 30,000 feet in ideal conditions. But what you completely ignored was that a free-falling object from 5 miles up goes through all types of air currents, which will throw it off. And if you hit the target, it's an accident.
Brad Washabaugh.
Thank you. Great to have you aboard, Lucky. You know, in
Thank you.
watching the series, I see several scenes where they hurry the crews off for debrief almost immediately. to gather intelligence. And that kind of leads me to my question, you know, as you were, the bomber command was devising these tactics and strategy, did they ever listen to the crews? Did they ever take suggestions? Did they ever hear from them what they thought was going right and what was going wrong? And another question I have is, with the flak batteries, why did we not try to avoid if they knew where they were, why couldn't you fly in a route that was out of their concentration, or perhaps obscure or attack the main concentrations of flak batteries to either divert or lessen the effects on the main effort of the bomber crews?
Well, those are good questions, Brad, and I don't blame you for wondering about them. Let me sort of address them in reverse order, though. As far as the anti-aircraft defenses of the German targets were concerned, Glenn alluded to the fact that the Germans developed radar, and they actually could send that to their anti-aircraft batteries, and the batteries could automatically calculate what our altitude and direction and all the other factors and compute that, and they were electronically fired. So that, but there was about a 25 or 35 second interval between the time that shell left the gun and the time it reached our altitude. And so in that period of time, if we deviated a half a degree or 1 degree, it was much more effective than our attempting to take evasive action individually. But if the formation leader was smart enough to just vary the direction slightly, it could throw the whole battery off. And that was much more effective than trying to dodge it, because as you know, if you zig, you probably should have zagged. And instead of flying away from it, you flew into it. But those were just some of the things that we had to contend with. And we were not able to, we were so bitterly cold, being unpressurized, that it was impeding our ability to function drastically. And we were sitting in that cold environment for 5 or 6 hours, and you were numb, and you were just acting on impulse and a reflective action to counteract the dangers and the emergencies that you experienced. So it was just a matter of pure luck if you survived it, because all of the conditions really were against you.
One episode. Now I'll stop there, only because it goes on for like 15, 20 minutes, and I don't think we have the time. If you'd like to hear all of Lucky's interviews that I've done with them, or any, I mean, if you Google Lucky Luckadoo on YouTube, you'll get 1,000 hits. Among them are 4 or 5 that are relative to us interviewing him, and Kevin Mounds, the author. He's really fascinating. Just, I mean, he goes on and on and on. He's, you know, he's the man. He was there. Rosie Rosenthal in the Apple TV series, one of my favorite characters in the series. This is him, his crew after the Munster mission. Under the 100th Bomber Group put up 17 planes, 4 turned back, 13 made it to the target. 13 planes dropped their bombs on the target. 1 came back. Rosie Rosenthal group. Lucky Luckadoo was scheduled to be on this flight, be on this mission. Lucky was promoted a day or 2 before to Bomber Squadron Commander, and he was stood down. He didn't have to fly that flight. He had flown 3 in a row before. And if you watch the series, he's standing on the control tower watching these planes come in. All he sees 1 plane come back. When he told me that story, I just, goosebumps, going up my neck. Jimmy Stewart, recognize him? We've interviewed, well, we didn't interview Jimmy Stewart, unfortunately. We interviewed the author, Robert Mattson, who wrote a book about Jimmy Stewart. There he is in 1942. There he is about 2.5 years later on the right side. Jimmy Stewart flew 11 missions and he couldn't fly anymore. He went to one of the flak farms on the TV series, right? Spent a few days there, came back on and off flew missions. He was promoted to squadron commander, eventually bomber group commander. He, PTSD among these pilots, the rate of it, they didn't call it that back then, combat fatigue. The Brits called it lack of moral fiber. So you can see what happened to this man in 2.5 years, right? And here's the thing, he was 35 years old. He didn't have to serve. He volunteered to serve. He had a civilian license. He begged to serve in combat. He was already a big time celebrity. They didn't want him to serve in combat because if he got shot down or captured, what would happen? He begged to go back, to go he flew B-24s. So he does fly, but he's 35 years old, 36 or 7 on the far right picture. Average age of a B-17 or B-24 pilot, 22, 23, a lot of 20-year-olds, a couple 19-year-olds, right? It's like an NFL player playing at 38 against a bunch of 21-year-old players, right? It's hard to do, right? So that's why it impacted him maybe more than others. He comes back to Hollywood. The book, Robert Matson's book on him is great. It's on the reading list. Comes back to Hollywood, can't find a job, can't act because he's so broken up. What's his first movie? Famous Christmas movie? It's a Wonderful Life. Remember that? Remember the scene where he's going to commit suicide and he's on the bridge? They did one take of that. He said, that's all he could do. And he said, I didn't act. All I had to do was think about my experience in flying B-24s during the war. And then after that, he finally kind of makes a pact of being a Hollywood star.
Was Clark Gable a gunner?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, he flew quite a few missions. Yeah.
He flew 21 missions, Clark Gable.
Yeah. Waist gunner. Made a documentary, which is kind of, I watched it on YouTube. I can't remember the name of it. It's not very fancy, but it's interesting. Yeah, Clark Gable was a gunner as well, a waist gunner. Yeah. So what happens? We're losing the air war in late 1943, right? Where the casualties and the planes going down are actually going down faster than we can replace. So what happens? This happens. That's a P-51. That's the original P-51 built in 1940, North American Republic in California, built by a Dutch-German engineer, funny enough, right? At the request of the U.S. Army Air Force and the Brits, right? It's built in 1940, doesn't go into action. I feel like I'm missing a slide anyway. Doesn't go into action until 1942, and it's put into action with the slides are out of order, with the RAF. It's underpowered because it has a US engine and an Allison engine. The Brits get it in 1942, and in late 1942, they put this engine, the Rolls-Royce 61. And it turns it into the fastest, best performing fighter plane on the planet. Better than the German planes by quite a stretch, just because of this engine change. And it could perform at very high altitude. And it had the range to take the bombers all the way to the target. Yet, the U.S. Army Air Force, in that bureaucracy, had a sort of not invented here kind of attitude about it, and still thought the bombers could get through, even though this plane could have been introduced in early 1943, okay? This man, very interesting guy, Lieutenant Colonel Tommy Hitchcock. He's a investment banker in New York, polo player, sort of a bon vivant, a really interesting guy. He was a World War I fighter ace. He wants to go back and become and fly again in World War II. He's too old. He's in his late 40s, 50-ish. He becomes the air attaché. He becomes the champion of the P-51. He flies it. He recognizes its capabilities. He goes back and forth trying to convince Arnold and the other U.S. Army Air Force brass to employ the plane. Takes him all the way to the end of 1943 to get the plane. This man on the left is Colonel Blakesley. The guy on the right is Kepner, the head of Fighter Group Command for the U.S. He was a hotshot pilot, flew P-47s, was an ace several times over. He's asked to fly the P-51 in September, October of 1943. He flies it and says, what in the world are we waiting for? why is this plane not being used? It finally comes into use in late 1943 with the 8th Air Force, but in small numbers. Then gradually, as it's recognized to be a superior plane, it comes into greater and greater use. At the same time, the US production miracle is happening. That's the B-24 flight that Edsel Ford and his father put together up in Detroit, Willow Run. By the end of the war, they're making one bomber an hour. Right, back to that 17,000 or so bombers that were produced. Rose River becomes a famous icon, right? And now in 1943, 1944, these bombers and fighters are coming off the assembly lines in the thousands, right? And the crews are being trained. Think of the logistical nightmare of trying to train, 10 men for each crew. And you've got now 1,000 planes, right? And 10,000 crew, just in the 8th Air Force, okay? We finally gained air superiority over Normandy in early 1944. How do we do it? This man, anybody recognize him?
Yeah.
Jimmy Doolittle, one of my favorite guys. You want to read his biography, read his biography. The Luckiest Man Alive, I think it's called. Really a fascinating, right? Famous Doolittle Raider, all the things you know about Jimmy Doolittle. January 1944, he comes with Eisenhower to London, and he's put in charge of the 8th Air Force, and Ira Aker is kicked over to the Mediterranean, kind of unfairly. He makes a huge difference. What does he do? He lets guys like this, Bud Anderson, who's 102, P-51 pilot. I interviewed 4 years ago when he was only 98. After 2 hours, he was still talking. I said, Bud, I'm tired. I literally said, Bud. Can we stop now? He's still alive. He's not very healthy at this point. Can't really interview anymore. Triple Ace, right? So Jimmy Doolittle let guys like this go, because up until Jimmy Doolittle came, the escort fighters stayed with the bomber stream, right? They would take it to the extent they could to fly to the border of Germany and then come back. Even the P-51 stayed with the bomber stream. At this point, Jimmy Doolittle says, that's nuts. Yeah, some of you stay with the bomber stream. The rest of you, as opportunity allows, shoot down the German Air Force, which were the fighters. The F-109s, the Ju-88s, the FW-190s, shoot them down. And now you had the plane to do it, and you had the pilots to do it. 19 years old when he started, right? Who did they recruit to fly fighter planes then and now? 19 and 20-year-old cocky jocks. Guys that don't think they can be killed. Guys that don't know any better. Guys that have incredible, not only courage, but incredible, hand-eye coordination and skills. And that was him. And he'll tell you that story. He goes, yeah. He goes, you wouldn't have liked me back then. I was really a rat. Okay. And so that's a P-47 in this case. And they start, strafing runs on German airfields and so forth. All right. This, Ed Cottrell, he's coming with us to England, 102 years old, P-47 pilot through 55 missions. He's coming with us, yeah. He's from Western Pennsylvania, graduate of Slippery Rock. You never guess he was 102. He's coming with us, him and his daughter, right? He flies 55 missions. This is one mission where part of his plane was shot off. All of his flights were tactical flights. Okay, so he never shot at another plane in the air. He actually always flew from England or from Belgium or France. He would take off with his squadron of planes. They would attack a bridge or attack ground troops or attack a tank or something like that, fly back to the base. His missions only lasted an hour or two at most of an hour, right? Very different kind of thing, right? Yeah. Yeah, this is the 262 being shot down, and it's a P-51 in the background, flown by a man named Joe Peterburs, who I mentioned to somebody here. Joe Peterburs is also 101, soon to be 102. I've interviewed him many times. He lives in California. Joe Peterburs shot down this 262 late in the war, about 5 or 10 minutes, I don't have it, 5 or 10 minutes after this, he in turn is shot down while strafing an airfield. He's captured by the Germans, spends about 2 or 3 days in captivity. This is April of 1945. Things are in chaos. Him and his friends break out of the POW camp because the guards are kind of, slithering away. And he joins a Russian tank battalion. and fights with the Russian tank battalion for 2 weeks until the US Army picks him up, right at the end of the war. Fascinating guy, another great guy. There's more great stories about him. So gets to be 44, now we've got hundreds and hundreds of bombers bombing, and it all allows us to destroy the German Air Force and land at Normandy, mostly uncontested by the German Air Force. German Air Force, people say that there were only 2 flights that day, but that's wrong. There were about 200 sorties by the German Air Force on D-Day, okay? But 200 sorties it's nothing, right, in Air Force terms, and it was really not a factor. And just think about it, had the Air Force, the German Air Force been effective, and you had 5,000 ships sitting up there in this relatively small bay, you know, they could drop bombs all day and just about hit anything, right? But we could not have invaded Normandy if the 8th Air Force hadn't won this. 15th Air Force made a huge difference. Anybody have any relatives that flew with the 15th? I have quite a few that did. 15th flew out of Foggia, Italy, starting in early 1944. It became about 1/3 the size of the German Air Force. It's where the Tuskegee Airmen flew. This is Harry Stewart, who I interviewed a couple of times. He was 19 years old, turned 20 when he got into a P-51 in January 1945. This was his 3rd mission, and on his 3rd mission, he shot down 3 planes. And really an interesting guy, goes on to have a fascinating career. He's still with us, and I hope to interview him here in a couple of weeks again, when I start to do something on the 15th Air Force. Many became prisoners of war. Don't have time tonight to go into it. The mini-series, that dates me, a mini-series, and they don't call it that anymore. Goes into a lot of this. I've had 2 different programs on POWs, and I have a couple more coming up. Some fascinating stories. About 28,000 men from the 8th Air Force and the 15th Air Force are captured and put in POW camps.
Weren't quite a few Tuskegee Airmen from Swiftly?
Yes, there's a monument, not a monument, yeah, there's a monument on it, the Swickley Cemetery, and there's something at Greater Pitt Airport I've seen. Yes, there were.
Like 9 of them or something, I mean, it was like it was a big number.
Yeah, I don't remember the number. Talked to the woman who's the head of that foundation. I did the Harry Stewart interview. Yeah, there were several thousand Tuskegee Airmen. Of course, not too many of them were pilots. We're including all the ground crew, right? How many men, for every 10 guys that flew the bombers in the crew, how many men do you think were behind them in the logistical supply? Basically, you wouldn't know how many.
I don't know, I really don't.
40 or 50 men behind every man that flew. Right? Just think of the logistical supply. I'm going all the way back to the States. We didn't do it alone. The Brits had something to do with this. This is a Lancaster airplane. It was actually faster, carried more heavy bomber load, had more range than the B-17, B-24. We just don't like to admit it much because we're so American-centric. Very, very brave guys. British Bomber Command lost 50,000 men in World War II. Killed, not casualties, killed. Another 40 or 50,000 captured, and who knows how many wounded. We lost how many men in World War II in the Air War over Europe? About 31,000. Most of that, 75% from the 8th Air Force, and the rest from the 15th Air Force. And there was also the 9th Air Force, going back to Ed Cottrell. Ed Cottrell actually flew for the 9th Air Force, which was the tactical group. That's where the P-47s were at the end of the war. The 2-engine bombers were with the 9th Air Force. That was the tactical Air Force at the end of the war, as opposed to the 8th Air Force being the strategic Air Force. Many became prisoners of war. We didn't do it alone. Strategic bombing made a significant contribution to winning the war. At the end of the war, you're familiar with these scenes. These are the scenes in Germany, right? The place is bombed to smithereens, right? There's hardly one brick standing on another brick, right? I had a guy named Rob Ellers on that I interviewed. He is a U.S. Army intelligence, was a U.S. Army intelligence officer, and wrote a book called Targeting Germany or Targeting Berlin. Incredible in-depth understanding of how the intelligence behind where we bombed, what we bombed, how much we bombed, et cetera, et cetera. After the war, there's something called the U.S. Army Air Force Strategic Bombing Survey, which kind of poo-pooed the whole idea that the bombing had been effective. Over time, historians have come to believe that it was extremely effective because the German ground forces couldn't get artillery shells, couldn't get ammunition, right? We destroyed their ability to refine oil by the end of the war. So it made a huge difference and probably saved lots and lots of lives. They're going back to the very beginning with Bomber Harris from the RAF, not Curtis May, but Hap Arnold and others. The problem they had is they overpromised. They said in 1942 and 1943, we don't need to invade a ground invasion of Europe. Just let us bomb them into the Stone Age, which is what the May eventually said about Vietnam, if you remember that. Let us bomb them into the Stone Age and you won't have to invade, or if you invade, you'll just have to go in and, you know, clean things up. Really didn't happen that way. Had we had the capabilities in 1945, when we had 1,000 bomber raids, sometimes 1,300, 1,400, U.S. Air Force and 8th Air Force, or the British Air Force as well, had we had those capabilities in 1942 and 3, maybe it would have made a difference. But eventually, of course, we had to land and take Germany by storm. Miss, this is your
That's my dad.
dad, 8th Air Force veteran,
Right,
maintenance,
yeah.
right?
He was a machinist.
Machinist.
He worked on the planes that came back in, and he said that there were a lot of, planes that didn't come back, and Germany had a very strong air force.
Oh, yeah. Took a lot of men to make those planes go up. And then your father's name was,
Donald Vogel, Fogle.
and he was a ball turret gunner.
Yes, yeah, he died in 2010. He was 91 at the time, so he would be like 101 or 2 now if he was alive.
Wow.
But he wasn't injured.
No, wow.
We're like
35 missions. He came a little bit later in the war.
I don't know how he did it. That's crazy.
Yeah.
You're telling me all that stuff.
Yeah, so originally the mission count was 25. Originally, there was no mission count. And then in early spring of 42, they had to put in a 25 mission count because the men were at such low morale. Because basically they said, as Lucky Luckadoo said, hey, we're just guinea pigs. They're just sending us up to die. There's no chance anybody's going to get through this war, which had there been no mission count, they wouldn't have. Eventually put in 25 as a target for them to get to. And then in 44, they jumped it to 30 and then 35 missions. After 77% of all the men who flew for the 8th Air Force in 42 and 43 were casualties. After the beginning of 1944, with the P-51s coming in, and us beginning to shoot down the German Air Force, the casualty rates became much, much, much lower. Still a lot of casualties, but not those unacceptable rates that they were before. So your father was lucky, he probably flew in
Yeah, he
44
was.
and 45.
We have a lot of stories about, people then being shot on the plane, planes going down, that they would live, but they would not, they would get off the plane somehow.
You'd love hearing the Les Shrink interview that I did a couple weeks ago with alternative. If you give me your email, I'll send it to you.
Okay, I think I did write it on your paper that came around.
Okay, any questions?
Yeah, you see all these killings and slaughterings and everything else, and what happened to those 3 wonderful words, love one another? What happened to them?
Well, I'm a historian. I read every kind of history there is. And all I can tell you is it's been the same since the Stone Age. The only thing that's changed is the weapons. Literally, the only thing that's changed is the technology and the weapons. Instead of stone axes, we get all this stuff. I went through the Wright Air Force Museum a couple of years ago with my son who lives out in Columbus. Fascinating place, fascinating. I could spend 5 hours there. I could have spent 5 days there, but it depressed me. I was like, why do we need all these weapons that kill each other? Wish we could figure it out, but it's only been 5,000 years and we haven't figured it out. Yes, sir.
I had a question on one of the earliest slides you showed. It showed like all the American bases in East Anglia and sort of the British bases that were in the Midlands.
Yeah.
Now, how many like different, like actual airfields that the Americans flew out of?
Sorry.
Would there have been
I did
in
something.
East Anglia? Would there have been
42 heavy bomber group bases and 12 or 13 fighter group bases. The fighter group bases and the bomber group bases were separate.
Okay, and the other question is, why were they all in East Anglia? It would seem to be that would have been awfully dangerous to have them all
Yeah,
consult, like, why wouldn't they have been spread out like in other parts of England?
distance, range, that was the closest to get over the channel into France and into occupied Europe and Germany. You put it 100 miles back, yeah, it'd have been safer, but also you had that much less range and that much less bomb load, et cetera, et cetera. Plus, if you know East Anglia, I've been there and going there again, it's flat as a floor there, right? And so, yeah, and funny enough, not funny enough, I've asked that question of experts, why didn't the Germans bomb those bases? And the answer is, the Germans, this is why they lost the Battle of Britain, they never had a strategic air force. They only ever had a tactical air force. They never developed a 4-engine bomber. That they had some prototypes, but never none in the air. Yes, ma'am.
You know, when you show those tactical formations, they were flying so close
Box
together,
formation, yeah.
not being shot down. Were there a lot of disasters of them just not accurate flying?
Absolutely.
Into each other?
Well, the Hawkeye is a good movie to
Yes.
kind of put all
Yes.
this together.
As is the Masters of the Air TV series. 10,000 US Army Air Force men died in training. Died in training or in accidents that were non-combat accidents. When they took off from England, oftentimes they'd have to take off through the clouds. And there's these 42 bases at the end of the war, 42 bases, right? And they're only 5-10 miles apart. And you got 30-40 planes taking off at the same time from all these bases, going through the clouds, doing circles, trying to form up into these combat boxes, and eventually there's 1,000 planes up there, plus the fighter planes. So yes, there were accidents all the time of them hitting each other, getting lost in the fog, et cetera, et cetera. But this man back here.
Well, strategic error can be blamed on Hitler. In the summer of 1940, Goering wanted to bomb the bases, the military. Hitler believed that it would demoralize the British people if they bombed the civilians. Now, we too, the Allies, were guilty of that same fallacy because it did not demoralize, bombing civilians did not demoralize the Germans. No, it did not.
No.
It did a lot of damage, okay?
Yeah.
But it did not. It did not.
That's right. It didn't demoralize the Brits. It did demoralize the Germans. It did a lot of damage. But you're talking about not strategic bombing. You're talking about city terror bombing. So the U.S. Army Air Force would have said, no, there's a difference. Strategic bombing is going after infrastructure. Now, as you go attack some steel plant or railroad yard, you're going to kill civilians as well.
That's right.
The Brits had a whole different philosophy, and that was nighttime city terror bombing.
That's right.
They took out Hamburg, they took out Dresden, they took out all those places.
Because they were the Blitz, they were subjected to it.
That was Bomber Harris. So it's another unique story. And eventually, even though we had this high moral idea that we were not going to do that, eventually we joined them in doing it. And as Lucky Luckadoo said, the whole idea of precision bombing was a fallacy, right? When you bomb through the clouds, you were bombing civilians.
Eventually, by 1940, late 44, 45, we had gotten this down to a science, the US and Air Force. The first wave dropped what we would call explosive bombs. These bombs would explode and blow the roofs off. The second wave of bombers dropped the incendiary bombs. And now that the roofs are off the buildings, it would become an inferno. It's war. It's terrible, but it's war.
But up until World War II, that had never, of course, we didn't have the capability. We had relative, still throwing sticks and stones.
Ernest LeMay would be hung today by the news media, a man who advocated dropping napalm on,
Yeah, there were more people killed in the, March 1945 fire raid on Tokyo than the war at
Yes.
Hiroshima.
yes, but that's war.
All right, we are at time, but thank you so much.
Oh, yeah.